Blackwoods Return. New York, 1917. Margaret Hayes read the telegram over and over again. Sergeant Henry Whitaker is alive. She turned away for only a moment, just long enough to catch her breath. When she looked back, the ink had faded to nothing but a blank sheet of paper. Chapter 1. The Phantom Telegram. The paper felt brittle, almost fragile, in Margaret Hayes's trembling hands. Sergeant Henry Whitaker is alive. The words, stark black against the yellowish cream, had screamed at her just moments ago. Now, the paper was blank, a cruel mockery of the hope that had surged through her like a lightning strike. She blinked, her eyes stinging, sure that the dim light of her small New York apartment was playing tricks on her. But no, the telegram remained stubbornly, devastatingly empty. Margaret, a woman of 38, with the prematurely silvered hair that spoke of worry rather than age, sank onto the worn velvet chaise lounge. Her fingers, usually so adept at needlepoint and sketching, now fumbled uselessly with the blank slip of paper. Outside, the sounds of New York City in 1917, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the distant rumble of the elevated train, the cries of street vendors faded into a dull, meaningless hum. She had been so sure. So absolutely certain. The telegram had arrived just as the morning light was beginning to paint the cityscape in shades of gray and rose. The Western Union boy, a skinny lad with a cap perched precariously on his head, had thrust it at her with the practiced indifference of someone who delivered both joy and devastation with equal detachment. She had tipped him a nickel, her heart already pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Henry. Alive. It had been 2 years since the War Department had declared Sergeant Henry Whitaker killed in action, lost somewhere in the muddy hellscape of the French trenches. 2 years since her world had fractured, leaving her adrift in a sea of grief and polite, pitying condolences. 2 years of meticulously crafted normalcy, of sketching fashion plates for Harper's Bazaar, of attending charity luncheons with the other war widows, all the while feeling like a ghost in her own life. She ran a hand over the smooth surface of the telegram again, as if willing the words to reappear. She had read it, hadn't she? She hadn't imagined the sharp intake of breath, the dizzying rush of hope, the almost painful clench of her heart. She remembered the precise wording, the formal, official tone. Sergeant Henry Whitaker is alive. Further details to follow. But there were no further details. Just this blank, accusing piece of paper. Margaret rose, her legs feeling strangely unsteady. She walked to the small, cluttered desk by the window, where a framed photograph of Henry stood, a silent sentinel in the gathering gloom. He was smiling in the photograph, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his uniform crisp and new. It had been taken just before he shipped out, a lifetime ago, in a world that seemed impossibly innocent now. She picked up the photograph, tracing the outline of his face with a trembling finger. He had been her brother's best friend, a constant presence in her life since childhood. A quiet, steady man, with a dry wit and a surprisingly gentle heart. Their love had blossomed slowly, subtly, like a wildflower pushing its way through concrete. A love born of shared laughter, whispered confidences, and the unspoken understanding that had always existed between them. Their engagement had been brief, a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered promises before the war had swept him away. She had clung to those promises, to the memory of his last kiss, to the letters he had sent from the front letters filled with both the mundane details of army life and the fierce, unwavering love that had sustained her. Then the letters had stopped. The dreaded telegram had arrived. And her world had gone silent. Now this cruel, impossible phantom telegram. A wave of anger, sharp and sudden, washed over her. Was this some kind of elaborate hoax? A cruel joke played by someone who knew the depths of her grief? Or worse, a mistake, a clerical error that had resurrected a ghost only to snatch him away again? She needed answers. She needed to know if the fleeting words she had seen were real, or if she was truly losing her mind. Margaret straightened her shoulders, a flicker of the old fire returning to her eyes. She wouldn't succumb to despair. She wouldn't let this phantom telegram break her. She would find out the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how impossible. She glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was almost noon. The War Department offices in Washington would be open. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but she had to try. She reached for her hat, a simple straw bonnet adorned with a single, faded silk rose, and her worn leather handbag. She had a train to catch and a ghost to chase. The empty telegram, tucked carefully into her pocket, felt like a burning coal against her skin, a constant reminder of the hope she couldn't quite let go of and the fear that threatened to consume her. The city, once a background hum, seemed to be watching her, waiting. The very air was thick with unspoken questions. What would she find in Washington? Was Henry truly alive, or was she chasing a phantom, a figment of her grief-stricken imagination? Chapter 2. Whispers of the Past. The train rattled south, a steel serpent winding its way through the increasingly bleak landscape. Margaret sat by the window, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a counterpoint to the turmoil in her heart. The passing scenery, fields of brown stubble, skeletal trees reaching for the gray sky, the occasional glimpse of a smoke-belching factory mirrored the desolate landscape of her emotions. She clutched the empty telegram in her pocket, her fingers tracing its edges, as if seeking some tactile connection to the vanished words. The memory of that brief, electrifying moment when she had held hope in her hands was almost unbearable. She had spent the hours since leaving her apartment in a daze, moving through the motions of packing a small valise, purchasing a train ticket at Grand Central Terminal, and navigating the throngs of people, all with their own destinations, their own anxieties. The war had cast a long shadow over everything, even here, thousands of miles from the battlefields. Soldiers in uniform were everywhere, some fresh-faced and eager, others bearing the haunted look of those who had seen too much. Margaret felt a pang of guilt, a sharp stab of self-reproach. She was chasing a ghost, a phantom telegram, while these men were facing a very real and present danger. What right did she have to her private grief, her personal quest, when the world was teetering on the brink of chaos? But the thought of Henry, the image of his smiling face in the photograph, was a powerful anchor. It was a lifeline she wouldn't let go of. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure up his voice, the sound of his laughter, the feel of his hand in hers. She remembered a picnic they had shared in Central Park, just weeks before he left. They had sat beneath a sprawling oak tree, the sunlight dappling through the leaves, the air filled with the scent of freshly cut grass. He had read poetry to her, his voice low and resonant, his eyes filled with a love that had made her heart ache with its intensity. "Do you remember, Margaret," he had asked, his voice a husky whisper, "that poem by Tennyson? 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all?" She had nodded, unable to speak, tears welling in her eyes. She had known, even then, that their time together was precious, that the shadow of war loomed large over their fragile happiness. Now, those words echoed in her mind, a bittersweet reminder of what she had lost and what she might, just might, have a chance to reclaim. The train pulled into Union Station in Washington, D.C., a cavernous space filled with the echoing announcements of arrivals and departures, the hurried footsteps of travelers, and the pervasive smell of coal smoke and sweat. Margaret stepped onto the platform, feeling a wave of apprehension wash over her. This was a city of power, of secrets, of decisions that shaped the fate of nations. And she was just one woman, armed with a blank telegram and a desperate hope. She hailed a taxi, a rickety Ford Model T, and gave the driver the address of the War Department. The streets of Washington were bustling, a stark contrast to the quiet melancholy of the train journey. Flags flew everywhere, patriotic posters adorned the walls of buildings, and the air buzzed with a sense of urgency and purpose. As the taxi approached the War Department, a massive, imposing structure of gray stone, Margaret felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. This was it. This was where she would either find the answers she sought, or have her fragile hope shattered once and for all. She paid the driver, her hand trembling slightly, and walked towards the entrance. The building loomed over her, its sheer size and imposing architecture designed to intimidate. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. Inside, the War Department was a hive of activity. Clerks hurried through the corridors, their faces grim and determined. Officers in crisp uniforms barked orders, and the air was thick with the clatter of typewriters and the murmur of hushed conversations. Margaret approached the information desk, her heart pounding in her chest. A stern-looking woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun looked at her with an expression of weary impatience. "I need to inquire about a telegram," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A telegram concerning Sergeant Henry Whitaker." The woman raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp and assessing. "Do you have the telegram?" Margaret hesitated, then pulled the blank piece of paper from her pocket. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling. The words, they vanished. The woman's expression didn't change, but Margaret thought she saw a flicker of something pity, perhaps, or disbelief in her eyes. "Vanished?" The woman repeated, her voice flat. "Yes," Margaret insisted. "I saw them. I read them. It said that Sergeant Whitaker was alive." The woman sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "Madam," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "Sergeant Whitaker was declared killed in action 2 years ago. I'm afraid there must be some mistake." Margaret felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. This was exactly what she had feared. But she couldn't give up. Not yet. "But I saw the telegram," she persisted. "I know I did. Please, is there any way to check? Any records? Anything?" The woman hesitated, then tapped a few keys on a typewriter. She scanned the screen, her brow furrowed in concentration. After a moment, she looked up at Margaret, her expression unreadable. "There's a file on Sergeant Whitaker, of course," she said, "but it's marked closed. Deceased." "But could there have been an update?" Margaret asked, her voice pleading. "A mistake? Something?" The woman looked at her for a long moment, her gaze piercing. Then, she sighed again and reached for a file from a drawer. "I'll make an inquiry," she said, her voice grudging. "But I can't promise anything. And frankly, madam, I think you're chasing a ghost." She paused, a hint of something softer in her voice before adding, "A lot of people are these days." The words hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the shared grief that permeated the city, the nation, the world. What was it about this woman that seemed to crack the very foundation of her stoic facade? Did she believe her, or was the official just tired of dashed hopes and phantom news? Chapter 3. The Society of Vanished Men. The wait was agonizing. Margaret sat on a hard wooden bench in the cavernous waiting room, surrounded by a sea of anxious faces. Each tick of the large clock on the wall seemed to echo the pounding of her heart. The woman at the desk, whose name Margaret had learned was Mrs. Abernathy, had disappeared into the labyrinthine depths of the War Department, carrying with her Margaret's fragile hope and the blank telegram. Margaret tried to distract herself by observing the people around her. A young woman with tear-stained cheeks clutched a crumpled letter, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. An elderly couple sat stiffly, their hands clasped tightly together, their faces etched with worry. A soldier with a bandaged arm stared blankly ahead, his eyes hollow and distant. The war, it seemed, had touched everyone, leaving its indelible mark on their souls. She wondered about their stories, their losses, their hopes. Were they, too, chasing ghosts? Were they clinging to the faintest glimmer of possibility in a world that seemed determined to extinguish all light? After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Abernathy reappeared, her expression still unreadable. She beckoned Margaret to approach the desk. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, her voice low, "I've made some inquiries. And well, it seems there is something unusual about Sergeant Whitaker's file." Margaret's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. "Unusual? What do you mean?" Mrs. Abernathy hesitated, glancing around the busy room as if to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "The file is marked closed, as I said. Deceased. But there's a handwritten notation on the inside cover. A single word. Veritas." Margaret frowned. "Veritas? What does that mean?" "It's Latin," Mrs. Abernathy said. "It means truth.
Truth.
But what truth? The truth of his death? Or the truth of something else entirely? Who wrote it? Margaret asked. And when? Mrs. Abernathy shook her head. I don't know. The handwriting is unfamiliar. And there's no date. But I did some further digging. I spoke to a colleague in the records department, an older gentleman who's been here for many years. He seemed hesitant to talk, but he did mention something. Something about a group. A society, he called it. A society? Margaret repeated, her mind racing. What kind of society? He called it the Society of Vanished Men, Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice barely above a whisper. He said it was it's highly confidential. Off the record. He wouldn't say much more, but he did suggest that it might be connected to Sergeant Whitaker's case. A Society of Vanished Men. The phrase sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. It sounded like something out of a dime novel, a fantastical tale of intrigue and mystery. But the look on Mrs. Abernathy's face, the hushed tone of her voice, told Margaret that this was no fiction. How do I find out more about this society? Margaret asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Abernathy hesitated again. I don't know, she admitted. It's clearly not something the War Department wants to discuss openly. But my colleague did mention a name. A man named Alastair Finch. He said Finch might know something. Alastair Finch, Margaret repeated, etching the name into her memory. Where can I find him? He used to work for the War Department, Mrs. Abernathy said. But he left some time ago. My colleague said he runs a bookstore. In Georgetown. Finch's Folios, I believe it's called. A bookstore. An unlikely place for a man who might hold the key to a secret society and the fate of a missing soldier. But Margaret had nothing else to go on. Thank you, Margaret said, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you for your help. Mrs. Abernathy nodded, a flicker of warmth in her eyes. I hope you find what you're looking for, Mrs. Hayes, she said.
I truly do.
Margaret left the War Department, her mind buzzing with this new information. The phantom telegram had led her to a closed file, a cryptic notation, and a mysterious society. And now it was leading her to a bookstore in Georgetown and a man named Alastair Finch. As she hailed another taxi, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just chasing a ghost. She was unraveling a mystery, a conspiracy, perhaps, that reached far beyond her personal grief. She was entering a world of secrets and shadows, a world where the truth was elusive and dangerous. The taxi sped through the streets of Washington, the setting sun casting long shadows across the city. Margaret clutched the blank telegram in her pocket, its emptiness now filled with a new kind of weight, the weight of unspoken secrets and hidden truths. What secrets did this Veritas hold? Who was Alastair Finch, and would he be willing to share the secrets of the Society of Vanished Men? She felt a shiver, not entirely of fear, but of anticipation. The bookstore waited. Chapter 4. Across the Atlantic Divide. Finch's Folios was nestled on a quiet, tree-lined street in Georgetown, its windows displaying a curated collection of leather-bound books and antique maps. The bell above the door jingled softly as Margaret entered, the sound a gentle counterpoint to the frantic beating of her heart. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and beeswax. Bookshelves lined the walls, reaching from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes of every size and shape. A fire crackled merrily in a small hearth at the back of the shop, casting a warm, inviting glow. A man emerged from behind a towering stack of books, his face obscured by the shadows. He was tall and lean, with a shock of silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. He wore a worn tweed jacket and spectacles perched precariously on his nose. This had to be Alastair Finch. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. Margaret hesitated, unsure how to begin. She had rehearsed her questions on the taxi ride, but now, faced with this enigmatic figure, her words seemed to fail her. "Mr. Finch?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded, his eyes scrutinizing her with an intensity that made her feel both uncomfortable and strangely reassured. "I'm Margaret Hayes," she said. "I was given your name by a woman at the War Department." Mrs. Abernathy. A flicker of recognition crossed Finch's face, but he said nothing, simply waiting for her to continue. She told me, "You might know something about Sergeant Henry Whittaker," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength. "About a society. The Society of Vanished Men." Finch's expression remained unchanged, but Margaret thought she saw a tightening of his jaw, a subtle shift in his posture. He stepped out from behind the books, his movements slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Abernathy is a very resourceful woman," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "But she sometimes speaks out of turn." "She seemed to think you could help me," Margaret persisted. "She said there was something unusual about Sergeant Whittaker's file. A notation. Veritas." Finch studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes unwavering. Then, he sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "Sergeant Whittaker," he said, his voice low, "is a complicated case. And the Society of Vanished Men is not something I can discuss lightly. Especially not with a stranger." "I'm not a stranger," Margaret said, her voice rising in desperation. "I was engaged to Henry. I received a telegram, a phantom telegram. It seems saying he was alive. I need to know the truth." She pulled the blank telegram from her pocket and held it out to him. Finch took it, his fingers brushing hers, and examined it with a frown. "A phantom telegram," he repeated, his voice thoughtful. "Interesting." He handed the telegram back to her, his gaze meeting hers. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I believe you. I believe you saw something. But what you saw, it's not the whole story. The truth about Sergeant Whittaker, about the society, is far more complex, far more dangerous than you can imagine." "Dangerous?" Margaret repeated, a chill running down her spine. "Dangerous how?" Finch hesitated, then gestured towards a small, leather-bound armchair near the fireplace. "Please sit down," he said. "This will take some time to explain." Margaret sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Finch settled into a chair opposite her, the firelight flickering across his face, highlighting the lines of age and worry etched around his eyes. "The Society of Vanished Men," he began, his voice low and confidential, "is a clandestine organization. A network of individuals who operate outside the official channels of the military and the government. We deal with cases that are deemed too sensitive, too politically explosive, to be handled through normal means." "What kind of cases?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cases involving espionage, sabotage, disinformation," Finch said. "Cases where the truth must be buried or manipulated for the greater good. Cases where men must disappear." Disappear. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. "And Henry?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "What happened to him?" Finch leaned forward, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "Sergeant Whittaker was one of our best operatives," he said. "He was fluent in French and German, a skilled marksman, and a master of disguise. He was sent on a mission behind enemy lines, a mission of vital importance to the war effort. A mission from which he was not expected to return. But he did return," Margaret said, her voice rising in hope. "The telegram," Finch shook his head. "He was reported dead. Killed in action. That was the official story. The story we wanted the enemy to believe. The story we wanted everyone to believe." "But it wasn't true?" Margaret asked, her heart pounding. "No," Finch said. "It wasn't true. Sergeant Whittaker completed his mission. But he was compromised. Captured. Tortured. He learned things. Things that made him a liability. To both sides." A liability. The word chilled Margaret to the bone. "So what happened to him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Where is he now?" Finch hesitated, his gaze shifting to the flickering flames of the fire. "That," he said, "is something I cannot tell you. Not yet. Not until I know I can trust you." He paused, and before Margaret could protest, he added one more thing, and more pressingly, "Not until I know you can trust me. Because what I am about to ask of you, is going to require a great deal of faith on both our parts." The request hung in the air. What was he going to ask her to do? And what was he hiding? Chapter 5. The Scars He Carries. Margaret stared at Alistair Finch, the firelight casting dancing shadows on his face. making his expression even more unreadable. Trust. It was a fragile, precious commodity in this world of secrets and lies. Could she trust this man, this former intelligence operative who held the key to Henry's fate? Could he trust her, a woman driven by grief and a desperate hope? "What is it you want me to do?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Finch leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. "I need you to be patient," he said. "I need you to trust that I am working to uncover the truth about Sergeant Whitaker, about the society. But it's a delicate process. There are powerful forces at play, forces that would not hesitate to silence anyone who gets too close." "Silence?" Margaret repeated, a chill running down her spine. "Are you saying Henry is in danger?" "He always has been," Finch said, his voice grim. "And so are you now that you're involved." The weight of his words settled upon Margaret, a heavy burden of fear and uncertainty. She had stumbled into a world far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But she couldn't turn back. Not now. Not when she was so close to finding Henry. "I'm not afraid," Margaret said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I need to know what happened to him. I need to know if he's alive." Finch nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "I understand," he said. "And I will do everything in my power to help you. But I need your cooperation. I need you to be discreet. I need you to follow my instructions, without question." "What instructions?" Margaret asked. "For now," Finch said, "I need you to return to New York. Go back to your life as much as that is possible. Pretend you never received that telegram. Pretend you never came here." But Margaret began, protest rising in her throat. "It's for your own safety," Finch interrupted. "And for Henry's. The less you know, the less anyone knows you know, the better. I will contact you when I have more information. When it's safe." "How will you contact me?" Margaret asked. Finch smiled, a fleeting, enigmatic smile. "I have my ways," he said. "Just be patient. And be careful." He stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. Margaret rose as well, her legs feeling unsteady. She felt a mixture of frustration, fear, and a renewed sense of determination. She had learned so little and yet so much. "Mr. Finch," she said, as she reached the door, "you said Henry was compromised. Captured. Tortured. What did they do to him?" Finch hesitated, his gaze meeting hers. He opened his mouth as though to deliver an easy platitude, but shut it just as quickly, choosing instead a harder, more difficult truth. "The war leaves its scars," he said, his voice heavy with unspoken meaning, "on everyone. But some scars are deeper than others. Some are visible. Some are not. Henry, he carries scars that you may not be prepared to see." His words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the horrors of war, of the damage it inflicted on both body and soul. Margaret thought of the photograph of Henry, his smiling face, his bright, hopeful eyes. Would she even recognize him now? She stepped out into the cool night air, the bell above the door jingling softly behind her. The streets of Georgetown were quiet, the gaslights casting long, eerie shadows. She felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. She hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address of Union Station. As the taxi sped through the darkened streets, she replayed her conversation with Finch in her mind, trying to piece together the fragments of information, the hints, the warnings. She was no closer to finding Henry, and yet she felt a glimmer of hope. Finch had confirmed that the telegram, however fleeting, was real. Henry was alive, or at least he had been. He was out there, somewhere, bearing the scars of a war that had changed him, perhaps irrevocably. She had to find him. She had to see him, to touch him, to know that he was real. But she also knew that she was walking a dangerous path, a path shrouded in secrecy and shadowed by powerful enemies. As the train rattled back towards New York, Margaret clutched the blank telegram in her pocket, its emptiness now a symbol of both loss and possibility. She had a long journey ahead of her, a journey into the heart of darkness, a journey to find the man she loved, the man who had vanished into the shadows of war. And as she thought about the man she loved, she could not shake Finch's final words. What scars did Henry carry? And more pressingly, would their love be strong enough to bear them? Chapter 6. Letters from Nowhere. The return to New York was a blur. Margaret moved through the familiar routines of her life, sketching fashion plates, attending social gatherings, exchanging polite pleasantries with neighbors like a ghost, her mind preoccupied with the secrets she now carried. Finch's words echoed in her mind. Be patient. Be discreet. Pretend you never received that telegram. It was an impossible task. The phantom telegram, though blank, was a constant presence, a burning reminder of the hope that had been ignited and then seemingly extinguished. She found herself staring at the empty space on her desk where the telegram had first appeared, as if willing the words to reappear. She tried to focus on her work, on the intricate details of lace and silk, the elegant lines of the latest fashions. But her sketches lacked their usual vibrancy, her hand faltering, her mind wandering to the muddy trenches of France, to the hidden world of espionage and secrets that Finch had revealed. Days turned into weeks, and the silence from Finch stretched on, an agonizing void filled with unanswered questions. Margaret began to doubt herself, to wonder if she had imagined the entire encounter, if Finch was simply a figment of her grief-stricken imagination. Then one morning a letter arrived. It was a plain, unmarked envelope with no return address. Her name and address were written in a neat, unfamiliar script. Her heart pounded as she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. The message was brief, typed in a simple, unadorned font. He remembers the oak tree, the poem, the scent of your hair. He asks if you still wear the locket. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She was wearing the locket. It was a small, silver heart, containing a miniature portrait of Henry, a memento he had given her before he left. She never took it off. The oak tree, the poem, the scent of her hair. These were details only Henry would know, intimate memories shared between them, a secret language of love. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of relief, of joy, of renewed hope. He was alive. He remembered. And he was reaching out to her. But the letter raised more questions than it answered. Where was he? Who had sent this letter? How had they known about the locket, about their private memories? She reread the letter again and again, searching for clues, for any hint of the sender's identity. The paper was ordinary, the typeface generic. There was nothing to distinguish it, nothing to connect it to Finch, or to anyone else. She carefully folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, next to the blank telegram. These two pieces of paper, one empty, one filled with cryptic words, were her only links to Henry, her only tangible evidence that he was still out there. She knew she couldn't share this letter with anyone. Finch had warned her to be discreet, to trust no one. But the urge to confide in someone, to share the burden of her secret, was almost overwhelming. She thought of her sister, Eleanor, a practical, down-to-earth woman who had always been her confidant. But Eleanor was married to a prominent lawyer with political connections. Sharing this information with her could put Henry and herself at risk. She thought of her friends, the other war widows she met with regularly. But they were consumed by their own grief, their own struggles. She couldn't burden them with her secret, her uncertain hope. She was alone in this, adrift in a sea of secrecy and danger. But she was not defeated. The letter had given her renewed strength, a renewed determination to find Henry, no matter the cost. She decided to follow Finch's instructions, to return to her life, to wait for his next contact. But she would not be passive. She would be vigilant, observant, searching for clues, for any sign of Henry's presence. She started paying closer attention to the news, scanning the newspapers for any mention of unusual events, of captured spies, of escaped prisoners. She frequented the docks, watching the ships arrive from Europe, hoping to catch a glimpse of a familiar face. She even revisited the War Department, pretending to inquire about her brother's war record, subtly probing for any information about the Society of Vanished Men. But she was met with the same stonewalling, the same carefully guarded silence. The letter, however, was a turning point. She now had proof that wasn't just a figment of her imagination. He was out there. Somewhere. The city, once a place of routine and quiet grief, now seemed charged with a hidden energy, a sense of underlying mystery. She walked the streets with a new awareness, her senses heightened, her eyes searching for any sign, any clue that might lead her to Henry. Every stranger was a potential contact, every whispered conversation a potential message. And she continued to wear the locket, a silent beacon of hope, a constant reminder of the love that bound her to a man who had vanished, but who had not forgotten. It was a small connection, a subtle, meaningful connection that kept hope alive, a flicker in the growing darkness. But where was he? And who was sending these messages? And how long would she have to wait? Chapter 7. The Ink and the Blood. The second letter arrived 3 weeks later, tucked inside a fashion magazine delivered to her apartment. Margaret recognized the same plain envelope, the same unfamiliar handwriting. Her heart leaped with anticipation as she tore it open. This time, the message was longer, more detailed, but still shrouded in mystery. He is closer than you think. But he cannot reveal himself. Not yet. He is being watched. They're looking for you, too. Be careful who you trust. The ink hides secrets. The blood tells the truth. Margaret reread the letter, her mind racing. He is closer than you think. Was he in New York? Was he somewhere nearby, watching her, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself? He is being watched. They're looking for you, too. Who were they? The Society of Vanished Men? Enemy agents? The government? The threat felt real, palpable, a suffocating presence that closed in around her. Be careful who you trust. Finch's warning echoed in her mind. She had trusted no one, confided in no one. But the letter suggested that she was still vulnerable, that her movements were being monitored. The ink hides secrets. The blood tells the truth. What did this cryptic phrase mean? Was it a clue? A warning? A metaphor? Margaret decided to focus on the phrase about ink. She was a sketch artist, accustomed to working with ink, with the subtle nuances of line and shade. Could the ink refer to her work, to her fashion sketches? She spread out her recent sketches on her desk, examining them closely. They were the usual assortment of elegant gowns, stylish hats, and sophisticated accessories. But as she looked at them with a new perspective, she noticed something odd. One of the sketches, a design for a winter coat with intricate embroidery, featured a series of small, seemingly random dots along the hemline. They were barely noticeable, easily dismissed as stray marks or imperfections in the paper. But under a magnifying glass, the dots appeared to be deliberately placed, forming a pattern. Margaret's heart began to pound. Could this be a message? A coded communication hidden within the lines of her sketch? She carefully copied the pattern of dots onto a separate sheet of paper. She tried to decipher it, looking for a recognizable code, a cipher, anything that might make sense. She tried Morse code, a simple substitution cipher, even a musical notation. But nothing seemed to fit. Then, she remembered something Finch had said about Henry's skills. He was fluent in French and German, a skilled marksman, and a master of disguise. A master of disguise. And a master of codes, perhaps? She recalled a book she had seen in Finch's bookstore, a volume on cryptography, the art of secret writing. It had mentioned a variety of obscure codes, including one used by spies during the Napoleonic Wars, a system that involved using a grid and a keyword to encrypt and decrypt messages. Margaret felt a surge of excitement. Could this be the key? She constructed a grid, experimenting with different sizes and configurations. She tried various keywords, words that might be relevant to Henry, to their shared past, Veritas, Oak, Locket, New York. Finally, using the keyword France, she managed to decipher the pattern of dots. The message was brief, chilling, meet me. Pier 17. Midnight. Alone. Pier 17. Midnight. Alone. The message was clear, direct, and dangerous. She was being summoned to a clandestine meeting, a rendezvous with the man she loved, the man who had vanished into the shadows of war. But the risks were immense. She was being watched. She was being hunted. and she had no idea who she could trust. She thought of Finch. Should she contact him, tell him about the message? But the letter had warned her to be careful who she trusted. Could Finch be part of the they who were watching her? She decided to trust her instincts. She would go to Pier 17. She would meet Henry, and she would face whatever dangers awaited her. She spent the rest of the day preparing, her mind racing, her hands trembling. She chose a simple, dark dress, one that would allow her to blend into the shadows. She packed a small bag, containing a change of clothes, some money, and the 2 letters she had received. She hesitated, and then, after some thought, tucked away her father's old, and very illegal, pocket knife. As midnight approached, she left her apartment, her heart pounding in her chest. The streets of New York were dark and deserted, the gaslights casting long, eerie shadows. She felt a sense of unease, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as if she were being followed. She hoped she was not. The ink held secrets, and the blood held truths. She deciphered the ink. She had yet to face any blood. As she neared Pier 17, she was beginning to understand that they might be closer than she thought. And the meeting held more answers. Or maybe just more questions. Chapter 8. A meeting in the rain. A thick fog had rolled in from the harbor, shrouding Pier 17 in a damp, impenetrable cloak. The air was heavy with the smell of salt water and decaying wood. The only sounds were the mournful groan of a distant foghorn and the gentle lapping of waves against the pilings. Margaret arrived at the pier just before midnight, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The pier was deserted, the shadowy outlines of warehouses and loading cranes looming in the mist. The darkness was oppressive, punctuated only by the faint glow of a few gas lamps, their light diffused by the fog. She walked slowly along the pier, her eyes scanning the shadows, her ears straining for any sound. She felt utterly exposed, vulnerable, a solitary figure in a vast, empty landscape. She reached the end of the pier, where a small, rickety wooden staircase led down to a lower level, closer to the water. She hesitated, peering into the darkness below. "Henry?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence. She called again, louder this time. "Henry? Is that you?" A figure emerged from the shadows beneath the pier, slowly climbing the stairs. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. He was tall and lean, his face obscured by the darkness and the brim of a pulled-down hat. He wore a long, dark coat, its collar turned up against the damp chill. He moved with a cautious grace, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. As he approached, Margaret could make out more details. His hair, once a vibrant auburn, was now streaked with gray. His face was thinner, harder, etched with lines of pain and exhaustion. And his eyes were different. They were still the same intense blue, but they held a haunted, distant look, the look of a man who had seen too much. "Margaret?" he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. It was him. It was Henry, but a Henry she barely recognized. "Henry," she breathed, tears welling in her eyes. She rushed towards him, her arms outstretched. He caught her in a fierce embrace, holding her tight, as if afraid she might disappear. She clung to him, burying her face in his coat, breathing in the familiar scent of him, a mixture of tobacco, wool, and something else, something indefinable, something that spoke of hardship and survival. "You're alive," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I thought I'd lost you." "I know," he said, his voice rough. "I'm sorry. I couldn't contact you. It wasn't safe." They stood there for a long moment, locked in their embrace, the fog swirling around them, the sounds of the city muffled by the distance. It was a reunion born of grief and hope, of fear and relief. Finally, he pulled back, his hands still gripping her arms. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face, as if memorizing every detail. "You've changed," he said, his voice soft. "So have you," she replied, her voice trembling. He smiled, a fleeting, bittersweet smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The war does that to a man," he said. He reached up and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, savoring the feel of his skin against hers. "I read your letters," he said. "The ones Finch sent." "Finch?" Margaret asked, her eyes opening. "He sent them?" Henry nodded. "He's been looking out for me, helping me. He's the only one I can trust." "But the telegram," Margaret said. "The one that disappeared, was that from him, too?" Henry shook his head. "I don't know anything about a telegram," he said. "That must have been someone else. Someone who knew about me, about us. Someone else." The mystery deepened. "Henry," Margaret said, her voice urgent. "What happened to you?" "Finch said you were captured. Tortured. He said you were a liability." Henry's expression darkened. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the swirling fog. "It's a long story," he said. "A complicated story. And it's not safe to talk about it here. We need to get out of here. They're watching." "Who's watching?" Margaret asked, her voice filled with fear. "The society," Henry said. "And others. People who want me silenced. People who want to control the information I have." "But why?" Margaret asked. "What information?" Henry hesitated, then looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "It's about the war," he said. "About the lies they're telling. About the real reasons we're fighting. About the atrocities. Things they don't want the public to know." He stopped and took a shuddering breath. "Things I saw." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. The notebook. The truth. Written in blood, perhaps. "This," he said, his voice low, "contains everything. Names, dates, places. Evidence. Proof. It's the only thing that can expose them. And it's the only thing that can keep us safe." He handed the notebook to her. Margaret took it, her fingers trembling. It felt heavy in her hands, heavy with the weight of secrets, of truth, of danger. "We need to get this to someone we can trust," Henry said. "Someone who can publish it. Someone who can expose the truth." "But who?" Margaret asked. "Who can we trust?" Henry looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know anymore." A sudden downpour started, the rain coming down in sheets. Henry grabbed her hand. "We have to go. Now." Where were they going? And could they outrun the society? The mysterious they that hunted them both? Chapter 9. The Spy Among Us. The rain lashed against them, soaking them to the bone as they ran through the deserted streets. Henry, despite his weakened state, moved with a surprising agility, his senses honed by years of living on the edge. He led Margaret through a maze of narrow alleys and darkened passageways, his hand gripping hers tightly. "Where are we going?" Margaret gasped, struggling to keep up. "Somewhere safe," Henry replied, his voice terse. "Somewhere they won't find us. At least, not for a while." He led her to a small, nondescript building tucked away on a side street, a building that looked abandoned and forgotten. He produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the door, pulling her inside. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. It appeared to be an old, unused storage room, filled with crates, barrels, and discarded furniture covered in cobwebs. Henry lit a small oil lamp, casting a flickering, unsteady light that revealed the room's dilapidated state. He closed and bolted the door, then turned to Margaret, his face grim. "We'll be safe here for a few hours," he said. "But we can't stay long. They'll be looking for us." Margaret shivered, both from the cold and from the fear that gnawed at her. She looked around the room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. It was a bleak, depressing space, a far cry from the warmth and comfort of her apartment. "Henry," she said, her voice trembling, "who are they? Who is after you?" Henry sighed, running a hand through his wet hair. "It's complicated," he said. "There are factions within the society, competing interests. Some want to expose the truth. Others want to bury it. And there are those outside the society, government officials, industrialists, who have a vested interest in keeping the war going, in maintaining the lies." "But why you?" Margaret asked. "Why are you the target?" "Because I saw too much," Henry said, his voice bitter. Because I witnessed things that were never meant to be seen. Because I have proof. He gestured towards the leather-bound notebook, which Margaret still clutched in her hand. That notebook, he said, contains evidence of war crimes, of profiteering, of corruption at the highest levels. It's a threat to their power, to their wealth, to their entire system. Margaret opened the notebook, her fingers trembling. The pages were filled with Henry's cramped handwriting, a meticulous record of names, dates, places, and events. She recognized some of the names, prominent figures in government and industry. She saw references to battles she had read about in the newspapers, battles that had been presented as glorious victories, but which Henry described as senseless slaughters. She looked up at Henry, her eyes filled with horror. This is explosive," she said. "This could change everything." "That's why they want it," Henry said. "And that's why they want me silenced." A sudden noise from outside the door made them both jump. Henry grabbed the oil lamp and extinguished it, plunging the room into darkness. He motioned for Margaret to be silent. They listened, their hearts pounding, their ears straining for any sound. The rain continued to beat against the walls, masking any other noises. After a few minutes, Henry cautiously relit the lamp, his face tense. "I don't think they found us," he said. "But we need to be more careful." He began to pace the room, his mind clearly racing. "We need to get this notebook to someone who can publish it," he said. "Someone who can expose the truth to the world. But who can we trust?" Margaret thought for a moment. "What about Eleanor?" she suggested. "My sister. Her husband is a lawyer. He has connections." Henry shook his head. "Too risky," he said. "They could be watching her. They could be watching anyone connected to you." "What about the newspapers?" Margaret asked. "The New York Times? The Washington Post?" "Too dangerous," Henry said. "They're too easily infiltrated. The government has a lot of influence over the press. They could suppress the story, discredit it, or worse, use it to track us down." They were running out of options. They were trapped, hunted, with nowhere to turn. Suddenly, Margaret had an idea. "Finch," she said. "What about Alistair Finch? You said he was the only one you could trust." Henry hesitated. "I thought I could trust him," he said. "But I'm not so sure anymore. He's been acting strangely, distant, evasive. I think he might be playing both sides." "Playing both sides?" Margaret repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. "But he sent the letters. He helped you." "He sent the letters, yes," Henry said. "But they were cryptic, vague. They didn't give me any real information. And he knew about the telegram, even though I never told him. He's been keeping things from me, Margaret. I don't know why." Margaret felt a growing sense of unease. She had trusted Finch, relied on him. He had seemed like their only ally, their only hope. But now, Henry was suggesting that he might be a spy, a traitor, a wolf in sheep's clothing. He could even be the one who sent the telegram that erased itself as a way to lure her in. "If we can't trust Finch," Margaret said, her voice filled with despair, "who can we trust?" Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "We can only trust each other," he said. "We have to find a way to get this information out ourselves. We have to be our own reporters, our own publishers, our own protectors." But how? How could two people, alone and hunted, take on the powerful forces that were arrayed against them? How do two people become their own newspaper and survive? The rain picked up, obscuring any sounds from the outside. Were they safe? Or was someone or something closing in? Chapter 10. Promises in the dark. The small, damp storage room felt like a cage, closing in on them. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, amplifying their sense of isolation and vulnerability. Henry's revelation about Finch had shaken Margaret to her core, leaving her questioning everything she thought she knew. "We need a plan," Henry said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't stay here, and we can't go back to your apartment. They'll be watching both places." "But where can we go?" Margaret asked, her mind racing. "We have no money, no resources, no one to turn to." Henry paced the room, his brow furrowed in concentration. "There's a place," he said finally. A small cabin upstate, near the Catskills. It belonged to my uncle. He used it for hunting and fishing. It's remote, isolated. No one knows about it, except me. But how will we get there? Margaret asked. The trains, the roads, they'll be watching them. We'll have to travel by night, Henry said. Stick to the back roads, the forests. It will be difficult, dangerous, but it's our only chance. He looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with concern. Are you sure you're up for this? He asked. It won't be easy. We'll be facing hardship, exhaustion, and the constant threat of discovery. Margaret met his gaze, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She had come this far. She had faced loss, grief, and uncertainty. She wouldn't abandon Henry now, not when he needed her most. I'm with you, she said, her voice firm. Every step of the way. Henry smiled, a fleeting, grateful smile that warmed her heart. He reached out and took her hand, his grip strong and reassuring. We'll leave at dawn, he said. We'll need to gather supplies, food, water, anything we can find. And we'll need to destroy anything that could link us to this place. They spent the remaining hours of the night preparing for their escape. They searched the storage room, finding some old blankets, a few cans of food, a rusty canteen, and a tattered map of New York State. They tore up the letters Margaret had received, burning the fragments in the oil lamp, watching as the smoke curled up into the darkness. They wiped down any surfaces they had touched, erasing any trace of their presence. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, they were ready to leave. Henry cautiously opened the door, peering out into the street. It was still raining, a steady drizzle that washed the city clean. The streets were deserted, shrouded in a gray, misty light. Now, Henry whispered, "Stay close to me." They slipped out of the building, melting into the shadows, becoming ghosts in the early morning gloom. They moved quickly, silently, sticking to the back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares. As they walked, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were following their every move. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding, but saw nothing. Just the empty streets, the rain-washed buildings, the pervasive sense of unease. They reached the outskirts of the city, where the buildings gave way to open fields and patches of woodland. They followed a narrow, winding dirt road that led into the countryside, the rain gradually easing, the sky beginning to lighten. They walked for hours, their bodies aching, their feet sore, their clothes damp and clinging. They spoke little, conserving their energy, their minds focused on the journey ahead. As darkness fell, they found shelter in a small, abandoned barn, huddled together for warmth, sharing the meager food they had found. They took turns keeping watch, listening for any sounds, any sign of pursuit. Lying there in the darkness, wrapped in the old, musty blankets, Margaret felt a profound sense of intimacy with Henry, a closeness forged by shared danger, shared hardship, shared hope. They were alone in the world, their lives intertwined, their fates bound together. "Henry," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "do you think we'll make it?" He turned to her, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the cracks in the barn walls. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers gentle. "We have to," he said, his voice firm. "We have to believe that we will. We have to fight for our future, for our love, for the truth." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of longing, of passion, of a love that had endured despite the ravages of war, of time, of separation. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a promise made in the darkness, a vow to face whatever lay ahead, together. "I love you, Margaret," he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. "I never stopped loving you. I love you, too, Henry," she replied, tears welling in her eyes. "I always will." They held each other close, finding solace in their shared embrace, drawing strength from their love. They were two souls against the world, two hearts beating as one, two whispers in the darkness, promising each other a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. But would their love be enough? Were their promises strong enough to combat the shadows and enemies? And what would they find at the cabin? Chapter 11. The Price of Silence. The journey to the cabin was arduous, a grueling trek through dense forests, across rocky terrain, and over rushing streams. They traveled mostly at night, avoiding roads and towns, relying on Henry's knowledge of the wilderness and the tattered map they had found. They foraged for food, supplementing their meager supplies with berries, nuts, and roots. They slept in snatches, huddled together for warmth under the stars, or in abandoned shelters they stumbled upon. Margaret, despite her privileged upbringing, proved to be remarkably resilient, her spirit unbroken by the hardship. She never complained, never faltered, her determination fueled by her love for Henry and her belief in their mission. Henry, though weakened by his injuries and the trauma he had endured, pushed himself relentlessly, driven by a fierce need to protect Margaret and to expose the truth. He taught her how to navigate by the stars, how to build a fire, how to identify edible plants. He shared stories of his childhood, of his life before the war, of his dreams for the future. Their bond deepened with each passing day, forged by shared adversity, shared vulnerability, shared hope. They were two souls stripped bare, their past lives shed like old skins, their future uncertain, their present a constant struggle for survival. One evening, as they sat by a small campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, Henry spoke of his time in captivity, of the torture he had endured, of the secrets he had learned. "They wanted me to talk," he said, his voice low and strained. "They wanted me to betray my country, my comrades, my beliefs. They used methods that I can't even describe. They broke my body, Margaret, but they couldn't break my spirit." He showed her his scars, the physical marks of his ordeal, the welts and burns that crisscrossed his back and chest. Margaret traced them with her fingers, her heart aching with a mixture of pity, anger, and admiration. "I saw things," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Things that no human being should ever see. I saw innocent civilians slaughtered, villages destroyed, lies manufactured to justify the carnage. I saw the greed, the corruption, the utter disregard for human life." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a haunted, distant look. "That's why I have to expose them," he said. "I have to tell the world the truth. I have to make sure that what happened to me, what happened to so many others, never happens again." Margaret held him close, her arms wrapped around him, offering him comfort, solace, and the unwavering support he needed. "We'll do it together," she said, her voice firm. "We'll find a way." After several days of relentless travel, they finally reached the cabin. It was a small, rustic structure, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, overlooking a pristine lake. It was weathered and worn, but it offered shelter, safety, and a sense of seclusion. They spent the next few days settling in, making the cabin habitable. They cleaned, repaired, and gathered firewood. They fished in the lake, supplementing their dwindling supplies. They felt a sense of peace, of respite, a temporary escape from the dangers that pursued them. But their sanctuary was short-lived. One morning, as Margaret was returning from gathering water from the lake, she saw a figure standing in the clearing near the cabin. It was Alistair Finch. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, her mind racing. How had he found them? Was he friend or foe? Had Henry been right about him? She watched as Finch approached the cabin, his hand resting on the butt of a pistol holstered at his hip. He knocked on the door, his voice calm and measured. "Henry? Margaret? It's Alistair. I need to talk to you." Margaret hesitated, her hand reaching for the pocket knife she carried. She didn't know what to do. Should she confront him? Should she run? Should she alert Henry? Was this the day Henry had been so afraid of? Before she could make a decision, the door opened, and Henry stepped out, his face wary, his hand hovering near his own concealed weapon. He hadn't been carrying a gun during their trek, but the fact that he had one, stashed somewhere in the cabin, raised more questions. "Alistair," Henry said, his voice tight. "What are you doing here?" Finch smiled, a cold, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. I came to help you, he said. To protect you. To get the notebook to the right people. I thought you might be one of them, Henry said, his voice laced with suspicion. Them? Finch repeated, raising an eyebrow. You mean the society? I am the society, Henry. Or, at least, a part of it. A part that still believes in truth, in justice, in accountability. He stepped closer, his gaze shifting to Margaret. I know you don't trust me, he said. But I'm your only hope. The people who are after you, they're not just government agents or corrupt officials. There's something else. Something more dangerous. Something you can't even imagine. He paused, his expression turning grave. They're willing to pay any price for silence, he said. And they're getting closer. The price. What was it? And how far were they willing to go? Was Finch telling the truth, or leading them into a trap? Chapter 12. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. Margaret watched the exchange between Henry and Finch with a growing sense of unease. The air crackled with tension, suspicion hanging heavy between the two men. Finch's words, though seemingly reassuring, rang hollow, his smile too practiced, his eyes too cold. How did you find us? Henry asked, his voice still guarded. I have my resources, Finch replied, his gaze sweeping the clearing. I've been keeping track of you, making sure you were safe. Keeping track of us? Margaret interjected, her voice sharp. Or spying on us? Finch turned to her, his expression unreadable. Call it what you will, he said. The point is, I'm here to help. I know who has the power to publish the notebook, to expose the truth. But we need to act quickly. They're closing in. Who? Henry demanded. Who are they? Finch hesitated, his gaze shifting to the surrounding forest, as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. They're a faction within the society, he said, his voice low. A rogue element that has gone too far. They're not just interested in suppressing the truth, they're interested in controlling it, shaping it, using it for their own purposes. And what are those purposes? Margaret asked. Power, Finch said simply. Absolute power. They believe that the war is a necessary evil, a crucible in which a new world order can be forged. They believe that they are the chosen few, destined to rule over the masses, to guide humanity towards a predetermined future. His words sent a chill down Margaret's spine. It sounded like madness, like the ravings of a fanatic. But she had seen enough, experienced enough, to know that such madness could exist, that it could drive men to commit unspeakable acts. We need to get the notebook to someone we can trust, Henry said, his voice urgent. Someone outside the society, someone with no ties to the government or the military. I have a contact, Finch said. A journalist. An old friend. He's fearless, incorruptible. He's the only one who can publish the story without fear of reprisal. And where is this journalist? Henry asked. He's in New York, Finch said. We need to get back to the city as quickly and discreetly as possible. Henry hesitated, his eyes searching Finch's face. He was clearly torn, unsure whether to trust him, unsure what to do. Margaret, however, had made up her mind. She didn't trust Finch. Her instincts screamed at her that he was lying, that he was leading them into a trap. No, she said, her voice firm. We're not going with you. Finch turned to her, his expression surprised. What? He said. What are you talking about? I don't trust you, Alistair, Margaret said, her voice unwavering. I think you're one of them. I think you're here to take the notebook, to silence us. Finch's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed, his face hardening. You're being foolish, Margaret, he said, his voice cold. You don't understand the situation. You don't know who you're dealing with. I know enough, Margaret said. I know that Henry trusts me, and I trust my instincts. And my instincts tell me that you're not to be trusted. She stepped in front of Henry, shielding him from Finch's gaze. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the pocket knife, her hand trembling but her resolve firm. Get away from us, she said, her voice shaking. Leave us alone. Finch stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else. Something that looked almost like regret. He took a step back, his hand moving towards his pistol. You're making a mistake, Margaret, he said. A big mistake. Suddenly, A shot rang out. Finch staggered backward, his eyes widening in surprise. He clutched at his chest, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. He looked down at his wound, his face contorted in pain and disbelief. Margaret gasped, her eyes wide with horror. She hadn't fired the shot. She hadn't even drawn her knife fully. She looked at Henry, her heart pounding. He was standing there, his arm outstretched, a smoking pistol in his hand. He had shot Finch. He had killed him. "Henry," she whispered, her voice choked with shock. Henry lowered the pistol, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and grim determination. "I had to," he said, his voice trembling. "He was going to betray us."
He was one of them.
He looked at her, and she could see a decision made. An understanding passed between them, unspoken, but clear. "But how did you know?" Margaret asked, her mind reeling. "The letters," Henry said. "The ones he sent. They weren't just cryptic, they were coded. I realized it after we left New York. I deciphered them. They contained instructions, coordinates, meeting places. He was communicating with someone on the other side." He looked down at Finch's body, his expression filled with sorrow. "I trusted him," he said. "I thought he was my friend. But he was playing me all along. He was using me to get to the notebook." Betrayal. It was a bitter pill to swallow. The man they had thought was their ally, their protector, had been their enemy all along. They were alone again, more vulnerable than ever. They had lost their only contact, their only hope of getting the notebook to safety. They were hunted, not just by the society, but by a rogue faction within it, a faction that was willing to kill to achieve its goals. Henry looked at her, his face pale. It had to be done. There was no going back now. "We can't change the past. We can only change the future." And they won't stop looking for that notebook. Where would they go? What was left? They had only each other. Chapter 13. Echoes of Gunfire. The silence that followed the gunshot was deafening, broken only by the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore and the distant caw of a crow. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the violence that had just transpired. Margaret stared at Finch's lifeless body, her mind struggling to process what had happened. She had suspected him, yes, but to see him dead, shot by the man she loved, was a shock that left her numb. Henry stood there, the pistol still in his hand, his face a mask of conflicting emotions: grief, regret, determination, and a chilling sense of resolve. He looked older, harder, a man transformed by the crucible of war and betrayal. "We need to go," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion.
"Now.
Before they find us." He knelt beside Finch's body, his movements swift and efficient. He searched his pockets, finding a wallet, a set of keys, and a small, folded piece of paper. He examined the paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's a map," he said, his voice low. "A map of the city, with several locations marked. I don't know what they mean, but they could be important." He tucked the map into his pocket, then looked at Margaret. "Help me move him," he said. "We need to hide the body." Margaret hesitated, her stomach churning. She had never seen a dead body before, let alone touched one. But she knew Henry was right. They couldn't leave Finch's body there, in plain sight. It would be a beacon, attracting attention, leading their pursuers straight to them. Together, they dragged Finch's body into the woods, concealing it beneath a thick layer of leaves and branches. It was a grim, gruesome task, one that left Margaret feeling sickened and shaken. They returned to the cabin, their movements hurried and anxious. They gathered their few belongings, stuffing them into their packs. They wiped down any surfaces they had touched, erasing any trace of their presence. "Where will we go?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. Henry looked at the map he had taken from Finch, his finger tracing the marked locations. "I don't know," he said. "But we can't stay here. We need to get back to the city. We need to find someone we can trust, someone who can help us expose the truth." "But who?" Margaret asked, her voice filled with despair. "We've lost Finch. We have no one." Henry hesitated, then looked at her, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. "There's one person," he said. Someone I haven't seen in years. Someone who might be able to help. But it's a long shot. And it's dangerous. Who is it? Margaret asked. Her name is Isabella Rossi, Henry said. She's a journalist. A muckraker. She's fearless, independent, and she has a reputation for exposing corruption and injustice. She used to work for the New York Chronicle, but she was fired for being too outspoken. And you think she can help us? Margaret asked. She might, Henry said. She's the only one I can think of who has the courage, the resources, and the platform to publish the notebook. But she's also a target. She's made a lot of enemies. And she's not easy to find. He looked at Margaret, his eyes searching hers. It's a risk, he said. A big risk. But it's our only chance. Margaret nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She had come this far. She had faced death, betrayal, and uncertainty. She wouldn't give up now. Not when they were so close to exposing the truth. Let's do it, she said, her voice firm. Let's find Isabella Rossi. They left the cabin, disappearing into the wilderness, becoming ghosts once more. They traveled under the cover of darkness, avoiding roads and towns, their senses on high alert. As they walked, Margaret couldn't shake the image of Finch's dead body from her mind. She had suspected him, yes, but she had also hoped that she was wrong. She had hoped that he was their ally, their protector. She thought of the phantom telegram, the letters, the cryptic messages. Had they all been part of Finch's elaborate deception? Had he been manipulating them from the beginning? And what about the they he had spoken of, the rogue faction within the society?
Who were they?
What were their goals? And how far were they willing to go to achieve them? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered, unsettling. She felt as though they were caught in a web of lies, a labyrinth of deceit, with no clear path to safety, to truth, to justice. But she held on to Henry's hand, drawing strength from his presence, from his unwavering love. They were in this together. Two souls against the world, two hearts beating as one. And as she heard his breathing even out in sleep, his face finally relaxed, she made a silent vow.
She wouldn't be the weak link.
She would not be a liability. If they were going down, they'd be going down fighting. Together. Chapter 14. The Hospital of Lost Souls. The journey back to New York was fraught with peril. They traveled by foot, by stolen boat, and once, by clinging precariously to the underside of a freight train. They slept in abandoned buildings, in haylofts, in the open fields. They foraged for food, their bodies growing thinner, their clothes tattered and worn. Margaret, despite her exhaustion and fear, marveled at Henry's resilience, his resourcefulness, his unwavering determination. He seemed to have an instinct for survival, a sixth sense for danger, guiding them through the treacherous landscape with a quiet confidence that both reassured and intimidated her. They finally reached the outskirts of New York City, their bodies aching, their spirits weary, but their resolve unbroken. They entered the city under the cover of darkness, slipping through the shadows, avoiding the main thoroughfares, their senses on high alert. Henry led her to a dilapidated tenement building in a run-down neighborhood, a place where poverty and desperation hung heavy in the air. He knocked on a door on the third floor, a series of coded raps that sounded like a secret language. The door opened a crack, revealing a woman's wary eye. She was middle-aged, with a tired, lined face, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked at Henry, her expression unreadable. "Henry?" she said, her voice raspy. "Is that you?" "It's me, Maria," Henry said. "I need your help." The woman hesitated, then opened the door wider, allowing them to enter. The apartment was small and cramped, but clean and tidy. The air was thick with the smell of cooking and poverty. "Who's this?" Maria asked, her eyes fixed on Margaret. "This is Margaret," Henry said. "She's with me. We're in trouble." Maria studied Margaret for a moment, her gaze sharp and assessing. Then, she nodded, a flicker of understanding in her eyes.
"Come in," she said. "Sit down."
"You look like you haven't eaten in days." She offered them food, a simple stew of vegetables and meat, which they devoured hungrily. They hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Maria is an old friend, Henry explained to Margaret. She works at St. Vincent's Hospital. She's discreet. She can be trusted. St. Vincent's? Margaret repeated. The hospital? Henry nodded. It's a good place to hide, he said. It's always busy, crowded. Lots of people coming and going. It's easy to get lost in the crowd. But why are we here? Margaret asked. We need to find Isabella Rossi. I know, Henry said. But we need to rest. We need to recover. And we need information. Maria might be able to help us. Maria listened to their story, her expression grim. She knew about the society, about the war, about the corruption and lies that permeated the city, the nation. Isabella Rossi, she said, her voice thoughtful. She's a tough one. A real firebrand. She's made a lot of enemies. But she's also got a lot of friends. People who respect her, who believe in her. Do you know where she is? Henry asked. Maria hesitated. I've heard rumors, she said. Whispers. They say she's been working undercover, investigating something big. Something that could bring down the whole system. That sounds like our notebook, Margaret said. Maybe, Maria said. But she's been very careful. Very secretive.
She's not easy to find.
We have to find her, Henry said, his voice urgent. She's our only hope. Maria nodded. I'll make some inquiries, she said. I'll ask around. I know some people who might know something. But it will take time.
And it's dangerous.
We understand, Henry said. We'll be careful. Maria allowed them to stay in her apartment, a temporary sanctuary in the heart of the city. They slept on the floor, wrapped in blankets, grateful for the shelter, the food, the brief respite from their relentless flight. It was the first moment of true rest, however fleeting, since they had left the relative peace of the cabin. The next day, Maria left for work at the hospital, promising to return with any information she could gather. Henry and Margaret remained in the apartment, their nerves on edge, their ears straining for any sound, any sign of danger. As they waited, Margaret examined the map Henry had taken from Finch, studying the marked locations, trying to decipher their meaning. She recognized some of the addresses, prominent buildings in the City Hall, the Stock Exchange, the War Department. But others were unfamiliar. Addresses in obscure neighborhoods, places she had never heard of. One in particular caught her attention. Henry, she said, her voice low. Look at this. This address, it's near the docks. It's a warehouse. I remember seeing it when we arrived at Pier 17. Henry looked at the map, his brow furrowed. You're right, he said. I remember it too. It was dark, abandoned, but there was something strange about it. I couldn't quite place it. Maybe it's one of their meeting places, Margaret said. Maybe it's where they're hiding something. Or someone.
Henry hesitated. It's risky, he said.
But it might be worth checking out. We need to find something, anything, that can lead us to Isabella Rossi. They decided to wait until nightfall, then venture out to the warehouse, to see what secrets it held. The hospital, a place of healing, had become their temporary refuge. But they knew they couldn't stay there forever. They were still being hunted, still in danger. And the clock was ticking. They were hunted, and hiding in a place that held lost souls, which could have meant anything. But they needed Rossi. And the warehouse might be their only lead. Chapter 15. The Truth in His Eyes. Night fell, casting a cloak of darkness over the city. The streets outside Maria's apartment were alive with activity, the sounds of traffic, voices, and music blending into a cacophony of urban noise. Henry and Margaret prepared to leave, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Be careful, Maria said, her voice filled with concern. The docks are a dangerous place, especially at night. We will, Henry assured her. We'll be back as soon as we can. They slipped out of the apartment, melting into the shadows, becoming invisible in the crowded streets. They moved quickly, silently, sticking to the back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares. As they approached the docks, the air grew thick with the smell of salt water, fish, and decay. The sounds of the city faded, replaced by the creak of ships, the clang of metal, and the cries of seagulls. The warehouse loomed before them, a dark, imposing structure silhouetted against the night sky. It looked abandoned, its windows boarded up, its doors secured with heavy chains and padlocks. "This is it," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Henry nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He produced a small set of lockpicks from his pocket, his movements deft and practiced.
"Stay close to me," he said.
"And be ready to run." He approached the door, his fingers working quickly and silently on the lock. After a few minutes, he heard a click and the padlock sprang open. He carefully removed the chains, then pushed the door open a crack, peering inside. The interior was dark and cavernous, the air thick with dust and the smell of mildew. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. They slipped inside, closing the door behind them. They stood there for a moment, their eyes adjusting to the darkness, their ears straining for any sound. The warehouse was filled with crates, barrels, and stacks of lumber, all covered in a thick layer of dust. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. "Let's search," Henry whispered. "Look for anything that seems out of place. Any clues. Anything that might lead us to Isabella Rossi." They began to explore the warehouse, their movements slow and cautious. They examined the crates, peering inside, finding nothing but old tools, rusty machinery, and discarded junk. They searched the corners, the shadows, the hidden spaces, finding nothing but cobwebs and rat droppings. Just as they were about to give up, Margaret noticed something odd. A section of the floor, near the back of the warehouse, looked different from the rest. It was cleaner, less dusty, as if it had been recently swept. "Henry," she whispered, pointing to the floor.
"Look."
Henry knelt down, examining the floor closely. He ran his hand over the surface, feeling for any irregularities. "You're right," he said. "Something's different here. It's hollow." He tapped on the floor, listening to the sound. It echoed, a distinct hollow sound that contrasted with the solid thud of the surrounding floor. "There's something underneath," he said. "A hidden compartment. A cellar, maybe." He searched for a way to open it, looking for a lever, a switch, anything that might reveal the entrance. After a few minutes, he found it a small, almost invisible crack in the floor, near the wall. He inserted the blade of his knife into the crack, prying it open. A section of the floor lifted, revealing a dark, narrow opening, leading down into the depths of the warehouse. "Stay here," Henry said. "I'll go first." He descended into the opening, disappearing into the darkness. Margaret waited, her heart pounding, her ears straining for any sound. After what felt like an eternity, Henry reappeared, his face pale, his eyes wide. "You need to see this," he said, his voice trembling. Margaret followed him down into the hidden compartment. It was a small, damp cellar, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. The only light came from Henry's small oil lamp, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then she saw it. In the center of the cellar, there was a table. And on the table, there was a typewriter. And next to the typewriter, there were stacks of paper, covered in writing. Margaret recognized the writing. It was the same neat, precise script that she had seen on the letters that had been sent to her, the letters that had led them on this perilous journey. And then she saw something else. A small, silver locket, lying on the table, next to the typewriter. It was identical to the one she wore, the one Henry had given her, the one that contained his miniature portrait. Her heart stopped. Her blood ran cold. She looked at Henry, her eyes filled with horror, with disbelief, with a dawning realization that shattered everything she thought she knew. "Henry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "The letters, the locket, it was you. You sent them. You've been manipulating me all along." Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain, regret, and a chilling, unsettling calm. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to explain. He simply nodded, his face a mask of sorrow and resignation. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It was me. The truth. It was finally revealed." But it was not the truth Margaret had expected, not the truth she had hoped for. It was a truth that shattered her world, a truth that destroyed her love, a truth that left her utterly and completely betrayed. The truth, stark and simple, was in his eyes. A truth that made the echoes of gunfire sound almost gentle, almost kind, in comparison. What would he do now? Had he brought her here to kill her? Was she next? Chapter 16. A Dance of Deception. Margaret stared at Henry, her mind reeling, her heart breaking. The man she loved, the man she had trusted, the man she had risked everything for, had been deceiving her all along. The letters, the telegram, the clues, the dangers, it had all been a carefully orchestrated charade, a cruel and elaborate manipulation.
Why?
She whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Why did you do this? Why did you lie to me? Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions: pain, regret, guilt, and something else, something darker, something she couldn't quite decipher. It was the only way, he said, his voice low and strained. The only way to protect you. The only way to expose the truth. Protect me? Margaret repeated, her voice rising in anger and disbelief. You put me in danger. You dragged me into this nightmare. You made me believe that we were fighting for the same thing, that we were on the same side. We are on the same side, Henry insisted. The side of truth, of justice, of accountability. But the society, they're more powerful, more dangerous than you can imagine. They have eyes and ears everywhere. They control everything. I couldn't risk them finding out about you, about our relationship. I had to keep you at a distance, to protect you. By lying to me? Margaret challenged, her voice trembling. By making me believe that you were a victim, a hero, a man who had been wronged? I am a victim, Henry said, his voice rising in defense. I was wronged. I did see things, experience things, that no human being should ever have to endure. But I also did things. Things I'm not proud of. Things I can never take back. He paused, his gaze shifting to the stacks of paper on the table, to the typewriter, to the silver locket. The notebook, he said, his voice low. It's not just a record of war crimes, of corruption, of lies. It's also a confession. My confession. I was part of it, Margaret. I was complicit. I followed orders. I killed people. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had known that Henry had been a soldier, that he had fought in the war, that he had seen terrible things. But to hear him admit to killing, to being a part of the very evil he claimed to be fighting against, was a shock that left her reeling.
But why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why did you do it? I believed in the cause, Henry said, his voice filled with a mixture of bitterness and regret. I believed in my country, in my duty, in the need to defeat the enemy. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was fighting for a better world. But I was wrong. I was manipulated, deceived, just like everyone else. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. I wanted to expose the truth, he said. I wanted to make amends for my sins. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. I needed you. So you used me, Margaret said, her voice cold. You used my love, my trust, my grief, to get what you wanted. I know it was wrong, Henry said. I know I hurt you. I know I betrayed you. But I also fell in love with you. For real. The letters, they started as a deception, a way to manipulate you, to get you to do what I needed. But they became something more. They became real. I meant every word I wrote. I do love you, Margaret. I always will. Margaret stared at him, her heart torn between anger, hurt, and a lingering, undeniable love. She wanted to hate him, to despise him, to reject him. But she couldn't. She still loved him, despite everything. Despite the lies, the betrayal, the deception.
What now?
She asked, her voice weary. What happens now? Henry looked at the typewriter, at the stacks of paper, at the silver locket. We finish what we started, he said. We expose the truth. We publish the notebook. We bring down the society. We make them pay for their crimes. And how do we do that? Margaret asked. We're alone. We have no one to trust. We're being hunted. Henry smiled, a fleeting, enigmatic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
We're not alone, he said.
We have each other. And we have allies. People who have been waiting for this moment, people who have been working in the shadows, people who are ready to fight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the map he had taken from Finch, the map with the marked locations. These locations, he said, they're not just random addresses. They're meeting places, safe houses, places where we can find our allies, where we can plan our next move. He looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a renewed sense of determination, of hope. We're going to need help. We're up against an impossibly powerful enemy. I still don't know if I trust you, she said, her voice flat. I know, and that's on me. But if you don't trust me, trust that I want the same thing you do. To expose the truth. It was a dance of deception, played on a stage of lies. Where did it end? Who could she trust if not him? And what was the next step? Chapter 17. The Unsent Letter. The revelation of Henry's deception had left Margaret in a state of emotional turmoil. She felt betrayed, used, and yet, a part of her still clung to the love she had felt for him, the connection that had been forged through shared hardship and a seemingly shared purpose. She was torn between her desire for justice and her deep-seated hurt, between her need for truth and her profound disappointment. We need to find Isabella Rossi, Henry said, breaking the silence. She's the key to publishing the notebook. She's the only one who can expose the truth without fear of reprisal. And how do we find her? Margaret asked, her voice still laced with skepticism. You said she's in hiding, that she's made a lot of enemies. We start with these locations, Henry said, pointing to the map. We check them out, one by one. We look for clues, for any sign of her presence. We ask questions. We use our resources. Margaret looked at the map, her eyes scanning the marked addresses. She recognized some of them, prominent buildings in the city. Others were unfamiliar, places she had never heard of. It's risky, she said. We'll be exposed, vulnerable. They could be watching these places. We have no choice, Henry said. We can't stay here. We can't give up. We have to keep moving, keep searching, keep fighting. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding, for trust, for a second chance. I know I messed up, he said. I know I hurt you. But I need you, Margaret. I can't do this alone. We're stronger together. We can do this. We will do this. Margaret hesitated, her heart torn. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, to forgive him. But the wound of his betrayal was still fresh, still raw. She knew that blind trust was impossible, that she would always question his motives, his actions, his words. Finally, she spoke, choosing her words with care. I don't know if I can ever fully trust you again, Henry, she said, her voice low and measured. But I agree that we need to expose the truth. I agree that we need to find Isabella Rossi. I agree that we're stronger together, however damaged that together is at this point. So I'll work with you, she continued. But not for you. Not blindly. I'll be your partner, not your pawn. I'll make my own decisions, ask my own questions, follow my own instincts. And if I ever think you're lying to me again, if I ever sense that you're manipulating me, I'm gone. Do you understand? Henry nodded, his face etched with a mixture of relief and regret. I understand, he said. I wouldn't have it any other way. They left the warehouse, slipping back into the night, becoming shadows once more. They moved cautiously, their senses on high alert, their eyes scanning the streets for any sign of danger. They decided to start with the closest location on the map, a small, unassuming building near the waterfront. As they approached, they noticed a light flickering in one of the windows. Someone's there, Margaret whispered. Henry nodded.
Stay close to me, he said.
And be ready for anything. They approached the building, their movements slow and deliberate. Henry tried the door, finding it unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, peering inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale tobacco and cheap whiskey. It appeared to be a small, run-down bar, frequented by sailors, dockworkers, and other denizens of the waterfront. They entered the bar, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. There were a few patrons scattered around the room, nursing their drinks, their faces etched with weariness and despair. Henry approached the bartender, a burly man with a gruff expression and a handlebar mustache. "We're looking for someone," Henry said, his voice low. "A woman. A journalist. Isabella Rossi." The bartender looked at him, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Don't know her," he said, his voice gruff. "She might be using a different name," Henry said. "She's discreet. She's made some enemies." The bartender hesitated, then glanced around the room, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I've heard whispers," he said, his voice barely audible, "about a woman like that. They say she's been asking questions. About the war. About the society. About things that people don't want to talk about. Do you know where she is?" Margaret asked, her voice urgent. The bartender shook his head.
"No," he said.
"But I know someone who might. A woman named Sarah. She works at the library. The one on 42nd Street. She knows things. She sees things. She might be able to help you." "Thank you," Henry said. "We appreciate it." They left the bar, their hearts pounding with a renewed sense of hope. They had a lead, a name, a place to start. As they walked towards the library, Margaret noticed a small, crumpled piece of paper lying on the sidewalk. She picked it up, smoothing it out. It was a letter, handwritten, addressed to Henry. But it was not in Henry's handwriting. It was in a woman's script, elegant and flowing. The letter was unfinished, unsent. It began, "My dearest Henry, I know you're in danger. I know you're fighting for the truth. I know you're trying to protect me. But I can't stay silent any longer. I can't stand by and watch you risk your life, your soul, for a cause that seems lost. I'm coming to find you. I'm going to help you, no matter the cost." The letter ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted or had simply stopped, unable to continue. Margaret looked at Henry, her eyes filled with questions, with a growing sense of unease. "Who wrote this?"
she asked.
"Who is this woman? Who is coming for him? And what did she mean by a cause that seems lost?" Chapter 18. Flight from the Shadows. Henry stared at the letter, his face paling. He recognized the handwriting instantly. A wave of emotions washed over him: surprise, fear, a flicker of something that might have been hope, quickly extinguished by a chilling sense of dread. "It's from Isabella," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Isabella Rossi." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The journalist they had been searching for, the woman who held the key to exposing the truth, had been writing to Henry. And she was coming to find him. But how? Margaret asked, her mind racing. How did she know where you were? How did she know about the notebook? How did she know about us? "I don't know," Henry said, his voice strained. "I haven't spoken to her in years. I haven't contacted her. I don't know how she found out." He reread the letter, his brow furrowed in concentration. "She says she's coming to find me," he said. "That she's going to help me. But it's too dangerous. She doesn't know what she's getting into. She doesn't know who we're up against. She says she can't stay silent any longer," Margaret said, her voice low. "That she can't stand by and watch you risk your life. She sounds determined."
"She sounds like she cares about you."
Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions: guilt, regret, and a flicker of something that might have been longing. "Isabella and we have a history," he said, his voice hesitant. "We were close.
Once.
Before the war. We shared a passion for truth, for justice. We worked together on a few cases. We almost..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Margaret understood. They had almost been lovers. They had almost had a life together. But the war had intervened, changing everything, sending them down different paths, into different worlds. "She's in danger," Henry said, his voice urgent. "We need to find her. We need to warn her. We need to protect her." "But where do we start?" Margaret asked. "The letter doesn't say where she is, where she's coming from." "The library," Henry said, remembering the bartender's words. "Sarah, the woman at the library. She might know something. She might know where Isabella is." They decided to head to the library, to seek out Sarah, to try to intercept Isabella before she stumbled into the crosshairs of the society, or worse, the rogue faction that was hunting them. They moved quickly, their senses on high alert, their eyes scanning the streets for any sign of danger. They knew they were being watched, that their every move was being monitored. They were running out of time, running out of options, running out of places to hide. As they approached the library, a grand, imposing building on 42nd Street, they saw a commotion near the entrance. A crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and alarm. Police officers were pushing people back, cordoning off the area.
What's going on?
Margaret asked, her heart pounding. I don't know, Henry said, his voice tense. But it doesn't look good. They pushed their way through the crowd, trying to get a closer look. They saw a body lying on the steps of the library, covered in a white sheet. A pool of blood stained the pavement. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She recognized the shoes, the familiar brown brogues that peeked out from under the sheet. It's Sarah, she whispered, her voice choked with horror. The woman from the library.
She's dead.
Henry stared at the body, his face a mask of grief and grim determination. He knew this was a message, a warning, a brutal demonstration of the power and ruthlessness of their enemies. They had killed Sarah, the woman who might have known Isabella's whereabouts. They were closing in, eliminating anyone who might help them, anyone who might stand in their way. We need to get out of here, Henry said, his voice urgent.
Now.
Before they see us. They turned and fled, disappearing into the crowd, melting into the shadows of the city. They were running, not just from the society, but from a force that seemed to be everywhere, all-powerful, unstoppable. They were running, not just for their lives, but for the life of Isabella Rossi, the woman who held the key to exposing the truth, the woman who is now in mortal danger. They were running, not knowing where to go, who to trust, or how to survive. Their flight from the shadows had just begun. But how far could they run? And could they reach Rossi before it was too late? Chapter 19. The Shore of Redemption. The death of Sarah, the librarian, had shaken them both. It was a stark reminder of the ruthlessness of their enemies, of the danger they faced, of the price of silence. They were running out of time, out of options, out of places to hide. They found refuge in a small, abandoned church on the outskirts of the city, a place where the sounds of traffic and the cries of street vendors faded into a distant hum. The stained glass windows were broken, the pews were dusty, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. But it offered a temporary sanctuary, a place to rest, to regroup, to plan their next move. We need to find Isabella, Henry said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. She's in danger. She's walking into a trap.
But how?
Margaret asked, her voice filled with despair. We have no leads, no clues, no one to turn to. Henry paced the church, his mind racing. He thought of the map, of the marked locations, of the cryptic messages he had sent to Margaret, of the lies he had told, of the truth he had hidden. He stopped pacing, his eyes fixed on a small, wooden cross that hung on the wall, behind the altar. It was a simple cross, unadorned, but it held a powerful symbolism, a reminder of sacrifice, of redemption, of hope. The shore, he said, his voice low and thoughtful. The shore of redemption. Margaret looked at him, confused. What are you talking about?
She asked.
It's a phrase, Henry explained. A code. Something Isabella and I used to say to each other. It meant a place of safety, a place of new beginnings, a place where we could be ourselves, where we could be free. And where is the shore? Margaret asked. Henry smiled, a fleeting, bittersweet smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It's not a physical place, he said. It's a state of mind, a metaphor, but it's also a memory. He closed his eyes, his mind drifting back to a time before the war, to a time before the lies, before the betrayal, before the darkness. There was a place, he said, his voice soft. A small island, off the coast of Long Island. We used to go there, Isabella and I. We'd rent a small boat, sail out to the island, spend the day exploring, swimming, talking, dreaming. It was our sanctuary, our escape, our shore of redemption. And you think she's there? Margaret asked, her voice filled with a flicker of hope. I don't know, Henry said. But it's worth a try. It's the only place I can think of where she might go, where she might feel safe. They decided to head to Long Island, to search for the island, to find Isabella, to warn her, to protect her. They left the church, venturing back into the city, their senses on high alert. They moved cautiously, avoiding the main thoroughfares, sticking to the shadows, their eyes scanning the streets for any sign of danger. They managed to steal a small, battered car, hot wiring it with the skills Henry had learned in the society. They drove through the night, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the engine humming a steady, reassuring rhythm. As dawn broke, they reached the coast of Long Island. They found a small, secluded harbor where a few fishing boats were moored. They managed to borrow one of the boats, a small, sturdy vessel with a sputtering engine. They set out to sea, the salty air whipping through their hair, the sun rising over the horizon, painting the sky with vibrant colors. They navigated through the choppy waters, searching for the island, their eyes scanning the horizon. After several hours, they saw it. A small, green island, rising out of the sea, a haven of tranquility in a world of chaos. They approached the island cautiously, their hearts pounding. They found a small, hidden cove where they anchored the boat. They waded ashore, their feet sinking into the soft sand. The island was deserted, untouched, a pristine wilderness of trees, rocks, and wildflowers. They searched the island, calling out Isabella's name, their voices echoing through the stillness. They found a small, rustic cabin, nestled among the trees, overlooking the sea. The door was unlocked. They entered cautiously, their weapons drawn. The cabin was empty, but it showed signs of recent habitation. There was a fire burning in the hearth, a pot of coffee on the stove, a book lying open on a table. And on the table next to the book, there was a note. It was addressed to Henry. My dearest Henry, I know you'll find me. I know you'll come for me. I'm waiting for you. On the shore, where we can finally be free. Isabella. Henry looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and trepidation.
She's here, he said.
She's waiting for us.
But where?
They searched the island again, calling out Isabella's name, their voices echoing through the stillness. Finally, they found her. She was sitting on a rocky outcrop, overlooking the sea, her back to them, her hair flowing in the wind. She was wearing a simple white dress, her figure silhouetted against the bright blue sky. Isabella. Henry called out, his voice filled with emotion. She turned, her face radiant, her eyes shining with a mixture of joy and sadness. Henry, she said, her voice soft. You came. They ran towards her, embracing her, their hearts overflowing with relief, with love, with a renewed sense of hope. They were together, on the shore of redemption, their past behind them, their future uncertain, but their present filled with a fragile, precious moment of peace. But how long would it last? The island was beautiful, but they were still being hunted. Chapter 20. A New Dawn's Embrace. The reunion on the island was bittersweet, filled with a mixture of joy, relief, and a lingering sense of unease. They were together, Henry, Margaret, and Isabella, three souls bound by a shared past, a shared danger, and a shared hope for a better future. But they knew their sanctuary was temporary, their escape fleeting, their enemies relentless. Isabella listened to their story, her eyes filled with a mixture of horror and understanding. She had known about the society, about the corruption and lies that permeated the war effort. She had been investigating it herself, gathering evidence, seeking to expose the truth. I received your letters, Henry, she said, her voice soft. The ones you sent to Margaret. Henry looked at her, his face etched with guilt and regret. I'm sorry, Isabella, he said. I had to do it. I had to protect you both. I had to find a way to get the notebook to safety. I understand, Isabella said. But you hurt her, Henry. You lied to her. You used her. I know, Henry said, his voice low. And I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to her. He turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love. I love you, Margaret, he said. I know I don't deserve you, but I need you. We need you. We need your strength, your courage, your belief in the truth. Margaret looked at him, her heart torn. She still loved him, despite everything. But she also knew that their relationship was forever changed, that the trust had been broken, that the scars of his betrayal would always remain. She also knew that they were running out of time and out of options. "We can be stronger with the three of us," Margaret said. "We all want to see the truth in the notebook made public." "We need a plan," Isabella said. "We need to get the notebook to someone who can publish it, someone who can expose the society, someone who can bring down the corrupt officials who are profiting from this war." "I have a contact," Isabella said. "A friend. Someone I trust. He works for a small, independent newspaper in Boston. He's fearless, incorruptible. He's the only one I can think of who has the courage, the resources, and the platform to publish this story." "But how do we get the notebook to him?" Margaret asked. "We're being hunted. We're being watched. We can't just walk into a newspaper office and hand it over." "We'll have to be smart," Isabella said. "We'll have to be careful. We'll have to use deception." They spent the rest of the day devising a plan, a daring, dangerous scheme that would require all their courage, all their skill, all their cunning. They would use the society's own methods against them, using disguise, misdirection, and a network of secret contacts to get the notebook to safety. As night fell, they prepared to leave the island, to return to the mainland, to face their enemies, to fight for the truth. They knew the risks were immense, the odds stacked against them. But they were determined to succeed, to expose the lies, to bring justice to the victims, to build a better world. They stood on the shore, watching the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky with vibrant colors. It was a beautiful, breathtaking sight, a reminder of the beauty that still existed in the world, a symbol of hope, of renewal, of a new dawn. "We'll do this together," Henry said, his voice firm. He took Margaret's hand in one hand and Isabella's in the other. Three figures against the setting sun, united, for however brief a time, by a shared goal. They boarded the small boat, setting out to sea, their faces set with determination, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and hope. They were heading into the unknown, into the darkness, into the heart of the storm. But they were not alone. They had each other, and they had the truth, and that, they believed, was enough. As they sailed away from the island, Margaret looked back at the shore, at the place where they had found a brief moment of peace, a fleeting glimpse of redemption. She knew they might never return, that their future was uncertain, that their lives were forever changed. But she also knew that they had made a choice to fight for what was right, a choice to stand up for the truth, a choice to embrace a new dawn, no matter how dark the night might be. The plan was dangerous, improbable, and might very well get them all killed. But it was the only choice they had. Epilogue. The plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. They would use the upcoming Armistice Day celebrations in New York City as a cover, a chaotic backdrop for their desperate gamble. The city would be overflowing with people, a sea of jubilant faces, waving flags, and patriotic fervor. It was the perfect environment for misdirection, for disguise, for slipping through the cracks. Isabella, with her contacts in the city's underground, managed to secure forged identity papers, disguises, and a series of safe houses, each a temporary refuge, a stepping stone on their perilous journey. Henry, with his knowledge of the society's methods and his skills in espionage, mapped out a route, a complex web of movements designed to confuse their pursuers, to throw them off their scent. Margaret, with her artistic talent and her newfound resilience, crafted a series of diversions, false trails, and coded messages designed to mislead the enemy and to communicate with their contact in Boston. The day of the armistice celebrations arrived, a day of both joy and trepidation. The city was a riot of color, sound, and emotion. People poured into the streets, celebrating the end of the war, the victory of their nation, the hope for a brighter future. Henry, Margaret, and Isabella moved through the crowds, their disguises blending seamlessly with a throng of revelers. They were three needles in a haystack, three whispers in a hurricane of noise. They followed their carefully choreographed plan, moving from safe house to safe house, exchanging coded messages, leaving false trails, their every move calculated, their every breath held in anticipation. They encountered close calls, moments of near discovery, times when their hearts pounded in their chests, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. But they persevered, driven by their shared purpose, their unwavering belief in the truth, their desperate hope for redemption. Finally, they reached the final stage of their plan. They were to meet their contact, Isabella's friend from the Boston newspaper, at a prearranged location, a small, unassuming bookstore near Times Square. They entered the bookstore, their hearts pounding. The owner, a quiet, bespectacled man with a knowing look in his eyes, greeted them with a nod. He led them to a back room, a hidden chamber filled with books, maps, and a printing press. "You have it?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Henry nodded, producing the leather-bound notebook from beneath his coat. He handed it to the man, his hand trembling.
"This is it," he said.
"The truth. The whole truth. About the war. About the society. About the lies." The man took the notebook, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and determination. "I'll get this published," he said. "I'll make sure the world knows the truth." They had done it. They had succeeded. They had delivered the notebook to safety, to someone who could expose the truth, to someone who could bring down the powerful forces that had sought to silence them. But their journey was not over. They were still being hunted, still in danger. They needed to disappear, to vanish, to start new lives under new identities in a new place. They left the bookstore, slipping back into the crowds, becoming invisible once more. They walked hand in hand, Henry, Margaret, and Isabella, three souls forever bound by their shared experience, their shared sacrifice, their shared victory. They had chosen separate paths.
Henry decided to go west.
To escape, far away from everything he'd ever known. Margaret had also made a choice, to dedicate her life to helping the wounded and the broken, to use her skills to help heal the scars of war. Isabella remained in journalism, a fierce voice and advocate, determined to continue her work. As they walked, Margaret looked up at the sky, at the first stars of evening appearing in the twilight. The war was over. The fighting had stopped. But the battle for truth, for justice, for a better world, was just beginning. And as she walked, she felt a sense of peace, of closure, of hope. She had faced her demons, she had confronted her fears, she had found her strength. She had lost much, but she had also gained something precious, something enduring, the knowledge that she had done what was right, that she had fought for the truth, that she had loved and been loved in return. The echoes of gunfire had faded. The whispers of the past had been silenced. The phantom telegram had finally revealed its true meaning. It had not been a message of death, but a message of life, a message of hope, a message of a new dawn's embrace. And, as Margaret looked towards her future, one where she vowed to heal and rebuild, it occurred to her that she did it with a strength she never knew she possessed, a resilience forged in the crucible of a love and a war that had tested her and transformed her. The end.